Jai Shri Radhe, Sab Vaishnav ko Jai Shri Krishna. Day 64, reading the Varta stories, biographies of the 252 Vaishnav disciples of Sri Gosaiji. Aaj ke Anand ki Jai ho. Continuing from yesterday, the family members said, "Oh, dear daughter-in-law, well said. You have made a beneficial situation out of a misfortune. It must be the Lord's wish. The Lord's plan is always the best, and that rascal will forget us." Having taken this decision, the next morning they rented 2 carts and filled them with their things. On the next day they prepared everything. When the Muslim man saw the 2 packed carts, he asked the driver whose they were. He replied that one businessman's whole family was setting off for Gokul. He then also got ready to leave. The family then all walked with the cart and went for about 8 miles when they noticed that the Muslim man was following them. They thought, "The reason for which we are leaving our home behind is following us like a disease." They continued and reached Gokul after a few days. Then they hired a boat and told the boatman that the Muslim man was not with their party and that they should not allow him to sit in the boat nor bring him over the river. The boatman did not allow the Muslim to sit in the boat. They all reached the far shore while the Muslim remained seated on the banks of Sri Mataji. They all proceeded to have the sight of Sri Gosaiji. The doors of Sri Navneet Priyaji's temple were opened, and they all blissfully had the holy sight of the Lord's Rajbhog Aarti. Having settled the Lord down to his afternoon nap, Sri Gosaiji came to sit in his betak. Sri Gosaiji told the businessman not to cook that day, but to partake of Mahaprasad there. He asked, "How many of you are there?" He replied that there were 4 of them. Sri Gosaiji then said, "No, you are 5 people. Why did you say that there are only 4 of you? There is one more Vaishnava with your party. Please also call him here." The businessman said, "A few people came with us, but we are just 4 family members. They are our servants, and they are paid with food supplies which they cook and eat." Sri Gosaiji refuted, "I am not talking about the servants. There is another who has come with you. He is very attached to you. Please therefore call him here." Having said this, Sri Gosaiji went off to take prasad. When he had finished his meal and washed his hands and mouth and eaten some pan leaves, he placed out 5 plates of Mahaprasad. "Now," he said, "all 5 of you please partake of this Mahaprasad. Call the 5th person and then eat." Having given this instruction, he went inside. The 4 of them just sat there. Sri Gosaiji came out again and said, "Why are you sitting here without partaking of the Mahaprasad?" The businessman replied, "O great Maharaj, there is no 5th Vaishnava with us. There is me, my wife, my son and wife, and his wife, and no one else. There are quite a few others in the entourage, but whom did you wish me to call? You told us to sit and partake of the prasad, and we are sitting here." Sri Gosaiji again said, "Whom did you leave on the opposite river bank? Why have you behaved so inappropriately? He is a graced and accomplished Vaishnava, and you should call him to come here." The businessman felt abashed and kept quiet. Sri Gosaiji called one man and told him to take a boat to the other side of the river and to find one Vaishnava who was sitting there. "He is a bit demonic in appearance. Call him here." The man went over to the far bank, sat him in the boat and brought him over. He then told Sri Gosaiji that the man had arrived, and Sri Gosaiji told him to arrange for him to bathe on Sri Thakurani Ghat and then to give him some new clothes to wear before bringing him in. The Muslim bathed and changed his clothes and then came before Sri Gosaiji and bowed down to him. He had the vision of Sri Gosaiji as the Lord himself and felt very blessed. In this blissful state, he stood and stared straight at Sri Gosaiji. At that very moment, Sri Gosaiji initiated him with the Lord's name and Brahmasambandh simply through the grace-filled gaze of his eyes. Sri Gosaiji then commanded, "All 5 of you should now have your prasad." He made sure that the 5th person had a plate. He himself then brought a low chair and sat in the middle of all of them. On one side, that Vaishnava was sitting alone and eating, and on the other side, the 4 were also eating. They looked at Sri Gosaiji as they ate. Sri Gosaiji then got up and went inside. The one who was sitting alone fainted as he sat there and fell to the ground. He burned up in separation so much that he dropped his mortal coils then and there. There was a lot of noise as the Vaishnava family all cried out, "Oh, look, look, what has happened?" Sri Gosaiji heard all of this, and all the hairs on his body stood on end. His heart overflowed, and he said, It is very hard to be such a love-filled devotee." He then instructed the businessman and all the others, "Take him to the banks of Sri Mataji and perform his last rites." Those Vaishnavas began to make excuses not to do this, but Sri Gosaiji further instructed, "Do not have any doubts about this matter. He is a divine soul. Do not judge him by his body. He presents no threat to your Vaishnava Dharma. You will be pure again after a simple bath. Therefore go and perform his last rites. After that it shall explain to you who he was. The Vaishnavas took his body to the banks of the Sri Yamunaji river, and after obtaining some wood, cremated his body. They then all bathed and came home in a pure state. The next day Sri Gosaiji was in his betak. He would always give teachings before the afternoon services. He was doing this when those Vaishnavas came to him. They addressed him, "O great Maharaj, you had promised to tell us the truth about that person. Please do tell us who he was in his previous birth. How did he come to be born in such a form, and why did he die so suddenly, as he just did? Please tell us everything." Sri Gosaiji said, "O Vaishnavas, listen up. That Vaishnava had come there to Gokul with the businessman and his family. He was extremely attached to the son's wife. The husband and wife were sitting there. Sri Gosaiji began. In his previous birth, he was a Brahmin who lived in a village about 10 miles to the east of Patna. He was a recipient of great grace and an accomplished Vaishnava. Your daughter-in-law was his wife. She was also a great Vaishnava. They made very nice Seva to the Lord, and he used to speak directly to them. In the evenings they would talk together of the beloveds. They would often have such satsang long through the night. They never had a worldly relationship. They loved each other very, very much, and their love was spiritual. Once the Brahmin had gone out to beg when a Vaishnava came there. This Vaishnava used to come there from time to time to talk about the Lord. He would sit there for a few hours. She would read, and he would listen. His own home was not far away, so that day, when he came there, he asked her where her husband was. She said, "My husband is in the temple. The one with whom I live has gone out to beg and will be back soon. Please sit down." She made a place for him to sit. He sat down and began to discuss the divine pastimes with her. She asked the meaning of something, and he replied that it would be better discussed in a more private place. "Your house is near the road. It would not be appropriate for passers-by to hear it." She shut the door and closed the shutters, and just after this her husband came back home. He noticed that the door was locked, and he began to call out. His wife then opened the door. When he came indoors, he found the Vaishnava sitting there alone. The Brahmin doubted his intentions and also began to doubt his wife. He thought, "My wife is very young, and he is also a young man. I do not engage in a worldly relationship with her. She has also stated that she has no interest in such activities. However, they are both sitting here behind locked doors and windows, so this does not look good." The other Vaishnava greeted him in the Lord's name. In his angry and fault-finding state of mind, however, he did not reply. The Vaishnava realized that he must have gained a false impression, and so he went home. The husband was very angry with his wife and said, "What were you two talking about behind closed doors?" His wife told him that what they had been discussing. He, however, did not believe her and suspected the other Vaishnava. They sat and met and even greeted each other with the Lord's name, but he could not get those impure thoughts out of his mind. The wife had a deep spiritual love for her husband. She promised him that there had been no impropriety, but he doubted her. After some days, by the will of the Lord, the husband left his body, and he was reborn as a meat-eater of a contrary faith. Mlecha. So, concluding today's reading here, we will continue tomorrow. Sab Vaishnavan ko sadar, Saprem. Jai Shri Krishna, Jai Jai Shri Radhe.